Thank you, Alex. Per Bartlett Club mandate, my speaking area extends from here over to here. But I don't think that's going to be enough room for me. I think I'm going to need to take control of this area over here, and I'm going to need to take control of that area back there. So at this time, I'd like to ask you people to move, perhaps to the bar out there. Unfortunately, I can't let you use this door. It's for my exclusive use only. So I'm going to have to ask you to climb through the window and to go around the front. I've set up some security personnel out front here, and they'll be making sure that everything remains orderly. And what they're going to need is you to show a valid ID and a second photo identification. They may or may not let you through, even if your papers are in order. They can kind of be temperamental that way. So you've got 5 minutes to clear the area because the bulldozers are coming in. Obviously, I'm being ridiculous. You should stay where you're seated. I just wish the analogy were ridiculous. The fact is, the situation in Palestine is ridiculous. The people of Palestine live under Israeli occupation. In the West Bank, their homes are demolished, their olive groves are razed to the ground, their land and water is stolen by the Israeli government. The movement of every Palestinian man, woman, and child is restricted by a gigantic separation wall, a maze of military checkpoints, and Israeli-only roads. Children are separated from schools, the sick from medical care, workers from their jobs, and ordinary people from their family and their neighbors. And in the situation in Gaza, it's much worse. This is what occupation is like, and it affects real people. Recently, I was able to attend a presentation given by 2 exchange students from Palestine. For them, this is what life looks like. And if you're interested and you'd like to hear, they're going to be doing another presentation on March 25th at UAA at 7 p.m. And you can check our website, alaskansforpalestine.org, for details. Now, I could go on, but sometimes I fear that my friends in the Israeli government don't get an equal chance to have their voice heard. So at this time, I'd like to introduce my wife, Dawn Bonfield. She's actually a spokesperson for AIPAC. Now, it's not the lobby, the AIPAC that you're probably familiar with. It's actually the American-Israeli Propaganda Action Committee. And she'll be able to tell us the Israeli government's point of view. Welcome, Dawn. Everybody's talking about Tunisia, Egypt, and the magnificent rolling revolution that is sweeping the region. People are finally shedding the yoke of oppression from these oppressive dictators, and they're demanding justice. I assume you fully support these movements for democracy.
Thank you. We like to say that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. And frankly, we'd like to keep it that way. Say what you will about Hosni Mubarak, but he's good for security. Israel's security. Now, the fact is, the people of Egypt just aren't going to be as willing to turn a blind eye to the crimes against the Palestinians that the Israelis commit, as President Mubarak has been. So I'd like my fellow Americans to be just a little bit frightened of all the freedom going on in the Middle East. I like to say things like Muslim Brotherhood, without really knowing what that organization is. As for Egypt's future, we like Suleiman. Check your WikiLeaks. Israel identified Suleiman as their preferred successor to Mubarak back 2 years ago. Sure, he's a torturer, but at least with Suleiman, you know that money will still talk.
Interesting. Well, also in the news recently was the release of the Palestine Papers. These are documents outlining the negotiation process between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. The papers showed the willingness of the Palestinian Authority to make concessions so broad that one wonders whether the Palestinian people, who the PA supposedly represents, whether the people would even agree. Things like concessions on the right of return of Palestinians, or continued settlement building in East Jerusalem.
We love Mr. Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. Sometimes it seems like we share the same goals. They're so willing to just sell out their own people to hang on to that little bit of power that Israel gave to them. the Palestine papers. Really, the only bit of news here is that the corruptibility of the Palestinian Authority is news to anybody. Palestine papers, I love them. They actually give Israel some much-needed moral authority. Who does East Jerusalem belong to? Let's ask the Palestinian negotiators. Back in 2008, they conceded virtually every piece of illegal construction in Jerusalem to Israel. Almost every little bit. And as for right of return, well, let's just say that hardly anybody's going to be returning anywhere anytime soon. And Israel didn't give up a thing. Not an iota.
I'm sorry I can't share your enthusiasm for the broken, corrupted farce that's become known as the peace process. Israel routinely accuses Palestine of throwing up roadblocks and not being willing to make concessions, but the Palestine papers show that the PA was made enormous concessions, totally capitulating on some of the most problematic issues. And yet, as you say, Israel gave nothing. If one of the negotiating partners is not acting in good faith, it is Israel. Are you not struck by that irony?
No. You don't get it. It's not about peace. Israel wants everything. The land, the water, a Jewish majority. If peace were the issue, a two-state solution would have been put into place a long time ago. Think about what Zippy Livni said in response to those colossal concessions the Palestinians made in East Jerusalem. She said, "We do not like this suggestion because it does not meet our demands. And probably it was not easy for you to think about it, but I really do appreciate it."
If the Palestine papers aren't enough, WikiLeaks recently released documents that shed some light on Israeli intentions. Many U.S. diplomatic cables show that the blockade of Gaza was meant to, and I'll quote, was put the people on the brink of collapse without quite pushing it over the edge. This shows that Israel was well aware that their policies were taking a heavy toll on the civilian population of Gaza. And Dov Weisglass, an aide to Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, said, "The idea is to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger." You do realize this is collective punishment, which is not only illegal, it's completely immoral.
Oh, what's wrong with putting people on a diet? I'm on a diet. Blockade in Gaza has been a smashing success. Childhood obesity is never a problem in Gaza. Look, Israel is good for the Middle East. These Arab countries need to emulate Israel and quit trying to destroy it. Israel is a Western-style democracy. They have universal health care. They know what civil rights are. Gays have civil rights in Israel. And as a woman, I can tell you, I'd rather live in Israel than in any of the Muslim countries surrounding it.
What about the rights of Palestinian women? In the assault on Gaza, the Israeli bombs dropped on men, women, and children alike. And I don't recall the Israeli bombers asking anyone's sexual preference. What good is Israel's healthcare system to a dying Palestinian on the wrong side of a checkpoint? Palestinians live under Israeli occupation. They have no civil rights in the eyes of Israel.
Oh, it wasn't talking about Palestinians. Terrorists don't deserve civil rights.
Oh, interesting perspective given the crucial role terrorism played in the creation of Israel. Take the Stern Gang and the Irgun. They were responsible for numerous terrorist attacks back in the 30s and 40s. Assassinations like that of UN mediator Count Folt Bernadotte. Massacres of Palestinian villages like Deir Yassin where over 100 civilians were murdered. Train bombings, and most famously the King David bombing, King David Hotel bombing where 91 innocent people were murdered. Future Israeli Prime Ministers Yitzhak Shamir and Menachem Begin were actually members of these terrorist organizations. The Irgun was absorbed into the Israeli Defense Forces after the creation of Israel.
Ancient history.
You might like to call it ancient history. There's plenty of more recent examples, like the High Seas raid on the civilian flotilla that was bringing needed medical supplies and aid to the people of Gaza. 9 civilians were murdered in that case. Or you can take the assault on Gaza in the winter of 2008-2009, a one-sided terrorist attack utilizing cluster bombs, depleted uranium, white phosphorus in densely populated civilian areas. Destroyed were schools, homes, the UN headquarters. The Goldstone report enumerates numerous other terrorist acts committed by Israel that winter, including shooting individuals waving white flags and using Palestinian children as human shields.
The Goldstone report, biased and flawed.
Facts are facts, and the truth is the assault on Gaza was an aggressive act of war. The supreme war crime according to the Nuremberg principles, because it encompasses all crimes. Ironic that Israel would violate the Nuremberg principles. Now Netanyahu describes terrorism this way: the deliberate and systematic assault on civilians to inspire fear for political ends. He must have been talking about the assault on Gaza, which continues, by the way. Just the other week, Israeli jets bombed university buildings in Gaza. It went completely unreported in the mainstream media, but what's the point of these attacks if not to inspire fear for political ends?
He's always looking for ways to criminalize Israel. I wonder if I could even get you to admit that Israel has a right to exist. Of course, my insistence that he verbally confirm Israel's right to exist is somewhat problematic for me. Which Israel do I demand that he acknowledge? Well, certainly not the Israel of 1948. Significant gains on Palestinian land have been made since then. And not the Israel of 67 either. Israelis like the settlements and they'd like to keep them. No, the Palestinians just need to acknowledge Israel's right to exist, and then we'll let them know exactly where she will exist. The bottom line is the Palestinians don't want any Israel to exist anywhere. They're trying to wipe Israel off the face of the map. She can, and she will, defend herself.
I assure you, there is no one more aware of the existence of Israel than a Palestinian who is oppressed by that government on a daily basis. But as you were just mulling over, the borders of Israel have done nothing but expand since 1948. Meanwhile, Palestine has shrunk as a result. A nation is being wiped off the face of the map, but it is not Israel.
And this is the face of the new anti-Semitism.
Criticism of Israeli policies is no more anti-Semitic than criticizing Barack Obama's policies as anti-American. This charge is used by people like you who fear the truth and want to end discussion. You try to intimidate and bully people who criticize Israeli policies. And by continually lobbying the anti-Semitism charge, it weakens it. And it does a disservice to those people who are actually subjected to real anti-Semitism. And there's nothing Semitic about bulldozing homes, checkpoints, or terrorizing women and children.
Look, I'd like to get us back on track. Let's stay focused on the important thing. I'm going to take this opportunity to quote Golda Meir. There will be peace when the Arabs love their children as much as they hate the Jews.
I see. Okay, I'm starting to understand how your propaganda works. You say something completely ridiculous, get other people to repeat it for you, and then hope something sticks. But if you want to trade quotes, I've got one in response. David Ben-Gurion said, "If I knew that it was possible to save all the children of Germany by transporting them to England, and only half by transferring them to the land of Israel, I would choose the latter. For before us lies not only the numbers of these children, but the historical reckoning of the people of Israel." In the end, it's all smoke and mirrors, so that Israel doesn't have to recognize it.
Don't say it. Don't you dare say the O word.
But you have to mention the occupation. The illegal Israeli occupation of Palestine is the bottom line. It is the root cause of the conflict. I'm curious, why don't you ever mention the occupation?
Doesn't fit the narrative. We'd rather you didn't look at Israel like an occupier. We'd rather you saw her as an innocent victim defending herself in a sea of Arab aggressors. When you call Israel an occupier, it draws attention to the fact that the land is stolen. Not real sympathetic, and it just might jeopardize the $3 billion a year that Israel gets in military aid from the U.S.
I know. That's why I do mention it.
Thank you.